The Crimean War is often seen as a key war of the 19th century. Russia was attempting to ensure dominance over the declining Ottoman Empire, while the Western powers were attempting to keep the Ottomans intact to preserve the balance of power in Eastern Europe. The war essentially began as a contest between Napoleon III, who wanted to prove that he was a force to be reckoned with, and Tsar Nicholas I, who thought himself defender of all Christians in the Ottoman Empire. After a lot of diplomatic negotiating, bribes and threats, Russia saw their position weaken. Britain sided with France, the Ottomans became bolstered by the support from the West, and Russia's official ally of Austria was, for now, remaining on the sidelines. Russia decided to show force and occupied Moldova and Wallachia, two Ottoman vassal states. Russia had assumed that Europe simply wouldn't care, especially after Austria publicly backed the Russian move, and that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Instead of support from Austria, the four great powers of Prussia, Austria, France and Britain met to discuss a peaceful way out of the standoff, but it was declined by the Ottomans. The Russians then blockaded and assaulted the Ottoman fleet, and both France and Britain officially joined the Ottoman side of the war. The following 2 years were a disaster for all parties involved. The Western powers had naval supremacy and they pestered Russian coastal holdings across the world. Most importantly though, they landed forces in Crimea, hoping to capture the key port of Sevastopol, forcing an end of the war by collapsing Russia's Black Sea capabilities in the region. Instead of a quick capture though, it became a devastating siege, where both sides realized the horrors of modern warfare. Most deaths during the war were caused by disease, and thanks to new technologies like photographs, the terrors of the war could be experienced in Britain and France as well. But eventually, Sevastopol would fall and a peace treaty would be signed. This peace treaty pretty much left no one fully happy. The Black Sea became neutral waters, with no warships or fortifications allowed, especially not from the Russian side. The Danubian principalities were officially returned to the Ottomans, but in practice, they, as well as Serbia, were now practically independent. And Moldova was also slightly enlarged. Furthermore, the Russians had to abandon their claim of being the protector of the Orthodox within the Ottoman Empire. Following the war, Russia was obviously unhappy since they lost much influence over the Black Sea area, and they had lost their claims to influence over significant parts of the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, the Western powers weren't happy because the war was so painful and it solved very little. The core issue at hand was the stability of Eastern Europe. Allowing the Ottomans to fall and slowly get divided up by Russia and Austria would strengthen those two powers more, with especially the rise of Russia being a terrifying prospect for Europe. A powerful and intact Ottoman Empire could hopefully keep both in check somehow. But the peace deal signed to end the Crimean War did nothing to solve the Ottoman issues. Its lacking bureaucracy and modernization still ensured that it couldn't compete with the others militarily, while the issues of increasing nationalism and opposition to Ottoman rule in the Balkans and elsewhere hadn't been addressed either. Following this war, Russia, Austria and later Italy would continue to look at the Balkans with ambitious plans as the Christians of the Balkans fought for their independence. Russia under Alexander II would see this war as a point of reflection. They realized that they couldn't compete with the West if they didn't modernize. In terms of European population, they were larger than the other great powers, but their infrastructure, industry and army lagged behind the times. Following the Crimean War, Russia increasingly attempted to modernize itself by investing in infrastructure, abolishing serfdom, and allowing some more limited freedoms. Russia also got less interested in their holdings in Alaska, as Alaska would be impossible to hold in another war with the British. This led to Russia eventually selling the territory off to the US. Then another minor point is that the Crimean War allowed Sardinia-Piedmont to put itself on the diplomatic map. They had sided with France and Britain, gaining the favor of both. Especially their new friends in France would prove useful later, as Sardinia-Piedmont would go on to be the state that unified Italy. So what if this all changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Russia managed to win the Crimean War? But how would this even happen? Well, it's not even that difficult to imagine. The war was seen as disastrous in the West, and public discontent was high. We, with our historical hindsight, know that Russia in 1856 was on the brink of economic ruin, but this didn't matter and wasn't known for the common person in France or Britain. They simply wanted out of this difficult war. If we have Russia somehow managing to push back the invasion force from Crimea, it is very well possible that the Western powers don't have the political support at home to muster another significant offensive, instead choosing for a careful peace. We will also have the Russians do somewhat better at the Caucasus front, putting some more pressure on the Ottomans. Now, one thing I've seen many people argue for is that Austria would remain an ally of the Russians if Russia won the war. I see no reason or evidence of this. Fact is that Austria felt threatened by Russian expansion into the Balkans from the very beginning. And despite never joining the war, they diplomatically supported the French and the British against the Russians from the very beginning. I would, in fact, argue the opposite. The more Russia is winning the war, the more Austria would move away from Russia towards the Ottomans and the Western powers. If Austria does join up with Russia, perhaps they gain Bosnia and a sphere of influence over Serbia, but in the process they weaken the Ottomans to such an extent that Russia would be able to continue to walk all over them, threatening Austrian interests in the region while building up the giant Russian Empire even more. The fact is that Austria was never going to support Russia, because despite their alliance, Russia was their rival. If anything, Austria would have been more likely to join the Western powers if it looked like Russia may fully collapse the Ottomans. With that settled, we are now ready to sign a peace deal. But what did the Russians hope to accomplish with this war? First and foremost is expansion. During research, I have seen some armchair historians claim that Russia would try to completely annex the Balkans, or even Anatolia, but this is way too extreme and this fundamentally misunderstands the politics of the time. Russia understands that there is a need for balance of power politics. Even if they managed to march all the way down to Constantinople, the West would never accept Russia's control over the entire Balkans from this one war. If Russia did push for something this radical, France and Britain would start preparing for a second round of conflict, and Austria and Prussia would think seriously about joining against the Russians. A victory would see Russia seize some border provinces, including most notably a protectorate over the Danubian principalities, but little more radical. In the peace deal, Russia would also claim the title of protector of the Orthodox Church within the Ottoman Empire. This meant that the Russian Church would get some control over the Orthodox churches of the Ottoman Empire, but it also gave Russia a justification to intervene in the Balkans if one of the Orthodox groups rebelled against the Ottomans. This alternate map is roughly what I would predict after a moderate Russian victory in the Crimean War. But what is happening inside Russia? In our timeline, Russia attempted to modernize after their defeat in the Crimean War, and I personally don't think that wouldn't happen if they had won. During the war, the conservative Russian Tsar Nicholas had passed away, leaving the throne to the much more reform-minded Tsar Alexander II. The war may not have been a defeat for the Russians, but it surely wasn't pretty either. Russia had come close to bankruptcy, their infrastructure was still clearly inadequate, and many still died from diseases, etc. Alexander II was a smart man. He knew that if the Western powers had decided to drag out the war, it would have been a matter of time before the Russian economy and then the military would have collapsed. Now with the victory in the war, the need for reforms may be slightly less clear to the Russian nobility, but Alexander would still steer the empire towards modernization, the abolishment of serfdom, and investment in infrastructure. Even the rationale behind the sale of Alaska hasn't changed a bit. There is still the fear of Britain seizing it in a future war, and the economic value of the territory wasn't enough to justify the cost of defending it. It is more than likely that Alaska is still sold. At the end of the day, and the sensationalist in me dislikes what I'm about to say, Russia, apart from the minor territorial adjustments, wouldn't be massively changed. Adding to this, Alexander II was a careful, or some would even say pacifist man. Despite him gaining protection over the Orthodox and the Ottomans, he isn't the type to march right into the Balkans to show the Sultan what's what anytime soon, knowing full well that France and Britain would join the Ottomans again, leading to a new conflict. Following the war, every other European great power would be wary of Russian ambitions. Alexander II understood balance of power politics, and he would realize that pushing further into the Balkan without clear support from the other great powers would only push them into an anti-Russian coalition, which Russia had no hope of winning. Napoleon III, the Emperor of France, would see himself as the biggest loser. The Crimean War was supposed to be his claim to fame, where he could show Europe that he was strong enough to protect the balance of power and defeat Russia. Defeat in the Crimean War would be extremely embarrassing and costly, and would likely lead to him trying even harder to assert himself as a great power in Europe. Napoleon III would constantly be warning the other powers about the dangers of Russian expansion, and would push even harder to see the formation of Italy happen under his watch. Which leads us to Austria. Austria would still see itself diplomatically isolated. They had abandoned their Russian allies, but they didn't fully join France and Britain either. Much like in our own timeline, this isolation would see their defeat against the Piedmontese and French, losing their influence over Italy, and then being defeated by Prussia, losing influence over Germany. Russia wouldn't interfere to defend Austria in either war. The Prussians would then go on to defeat the French, and we basically have the same situation as in our own timeline, both diplomatically and in terms of strength between the nations. If anything, we would see this alternate Russia being slightly weaker than in our own timeline, as Alexander's modernization efforts are more heavily opposed by the Russian aristocracy. Now that Germany has been formed and France has overthrown Napoleon III, the seeds for a future French-Russian partnership is built, finally breaking Russia's diplomatic isolation after their victory in the Crimean War. The final key event to cover would be the Balkan revolts of 1876. These revolts are the first significant uprising in the Ottoman Balkans after the new balance of power sets in Europe. Alexander II, happy with the opportunity to finally break Russia's diplomatic isolation, would much like in our own timeline seek friendship with Germany and France. Some form of the League of the Three Emperors would likely be signed in this timeline as well, binding Russia, Germany and Austria into an alliance. Alexander, now emboldened by his existing claim as the protector of the Orthodox, and their newfound European partners would still march onto the side of the rebels, and much like in our own timeline, Russia would win this war and march into Constantinople. But, just like in our own timeline, Russia doesn't have the freedom to simply dictate terms to the Ottoman Empire. European fears about Russian power are still the exact same, and there is no way that the other European powers would get behind a Russian-led dismemberment of the Ottomans. The Russians may manage to push for slightly more concessions than in our own timeline, but at the end of the day, the map of this alternate timeline is not radically different than the map of our own timeline, with the biggest difference being Russian influence over Romania. But at the end of this scenario, the alliances aren't radically altered, the borders aren't radically altered, and no major wars or conflicts have been radically altered. All in all, this scenario seems to be a bit of a letdown. Still, I decided to make and release this scenario to show what is in my opinion a major issue in the alternate history community. Not every event was a make or break moment between a nation's rise to superpower status or collapse. Russia's issues ran way deeper than the Crimean War, and while it was influential and important, it was not the key to Russian global hegemony. A Russian victory wouldn't change the fundamental of European diplomacy or politics. The same liberal-minded Tsar would come to power, Austria is still afraid of Russian expansion into the Balkans, inevitably breaking their alliance, Napoleon III is still seeking to prove himself, Britain and France still want to prop up the Ottoman Empire to protect the balance of power in Europe, etc. etc. There is a reason that, relatively speaking, 1815 until 1914 was a peaceful period in Europe. None of the great powers wanted to see the others dominating Europe, and none of the other European great powers would be happy to allow Russian domination over the Balkan in 1853 or later. The Crimean War was not a stepping stone for Russian dominance over the Balkans, as the rest of Europe would simply unite against the Russian threat. So with this map, I conclude this scenario. Let me know in the comments how you think the scenario develops from here. If you enjoyed the content, consider subscribing for at least one alternate history video every week. To help the video grow, consider leaving a like and a comment. It really helps out against the algorithm. Even just commenting something simple like hi helps the video out massively. Again, thank you all for watching, and a special thanks to these patrons who help me dedicate more time and effort to the channel by supporting me monetarily. To help the channel and get early access to videos whenever I complete them myself, consider supporting me there. Again, thank you for watching, and goodbye.